My name is Grace Nichols. I've lived here all my life. I lived on Snowdrop Avenue from 1923 to 1949, where I have moved to Burnside Road, 738, and I'm still living here today. And I still live on part of the property that belonged to my grandparents, which immigrated here to Canada in 1862.
What were their names?
My grandfather's name was Samuel C. He was a shipbuilder, and then in later years he decided to farm and built the property, which borders Mackenzie to Carey, to Burnside to Marigold, and back to Mackenzie. The original farmhouse was on where Mackenzie Avenue now is. He had 4 children. One was my mother, and she married my dad, who had immigrated out here from Scotland and had set up a greenhouse business growing tomatoes and cucumbers, chrysanthemums, sweet peas, and also outside produce, which was sold to grocery stores and also in the Victoria Public Market, which was situated down by Centennial Square in Victoria. And years ago, before the war, there used to be a hydro pole, which was called BC Electric at the time, and a fellow used to ride his bicycle, and at night he would have the long pole would be attached to the electric pole, and he would push the pole, his little pole up, and push the switch on, and in the morning he would come by and put it out at night, pull it out in the morning.
Right.
And that was our street lights, and they were far and few between. When you came out from the city of Victoria, even during the war, there was one at Burnside and Douglas Street, not another one till you got to Harriet Road, and then Tillicum Road, and Marigold Road, and then on to Wilkinson. And I don't think there was another one until you got to the interurban. And when you got off the bus at night, it was a dark place to walk. And especially during the war, when there was a brownout and people had to cover their windows to a point. It wasn't a blackout, but they called it a brownout. And we never felt uncomfortable, because there wasn't, growing up then was a different time from today, where you're really not comfortable walking at night and that. And
How was the bus service? Was it quite often?
I beg your pardon?
The bus service.
We had, well, actually we had it was every half hour, because one went out to Wilkinson and made the loop from Holland Avenue to Hastings and Holland, and the other one did the loop to the interurban and Marigold. And one would be coming by on the hour, and the other would be coming by on the half hour.
That's very good service.
Yes, that was back in the 30s and 40s. And they discontinued the one at the interurban, and it was just the hourly service on Burnside. I used to catch the bus when I worked downtown at Cross's Meat Market. I would catch the bus at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then I would come home on the 6 o'clock bus at night. And by the time you got home and had your supper, you were ready for bed.
It's a long day.
Yeah, and the bus fare when I grew up was 5 cents for children, and if we had a quarter, it would be 10 of that would have gone for bus fare, 10 cents to get into a movie matinee on a Saturday, and 5 cents for a nice chocolate bar. And
which movie theaters would you have gone
well,
to?
there would be the Capitol and the Dominion. I believe they
Oh.
were the only two at that time. There might have been one on Government Street. I
There's
don't really
two.
remember.
Hmm.
I think there was one called the Empire.
No, the Rio and the Atlas, I think it was.
Well, Atlas was up on
Oh, that's right.
Yates Street.
The Rio and the York,
That's right.
they were on Government Street.
And we had a fellow that used to sell meat. He'd run up and down the streets in his little truck, and he would sell small cuts of meat, and my mother would go out with a plate, and so would other mothers, and buy meat from his back of his truck. I doubt if any of it was really iced. And he would yell at the top of his lungs, "Butcher!" And of course they'd all open the doors and out they'd come. And later on, he built a little small grocery store, or meat market really, just off Marigold, off Burnside. And then in later years, his two sons operated it, and I worked for them twice after the war.
And what was his name?
George, and his name was Girton, and the sons' name were George and Gordon. And they had the meat market and grocery store and delivery, and the kids used to go to school, my boys, and I'd lock the door and go too, and I would come home before they would get out of school. So it was really handy and worked out quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And they lived next door to me, one of the sons, and the dad was, not the dad, the son that I worked for. He was the usher at our wedding, and his daughter, Gail Girton, which you know, was our flower girl.
Oh,
And they lived there until, and Molly just passed away this past year, the mother. And the farm across the street, which is now St. Joseph's Church and School, he had quite a farm of Holstein cows, and he would save all the washings from the barn into a large cement tank, which he'd mix with water, and he would spray it on his fields, and he, instead of getting 2 crops a year, he managed 3. And in those days, if you wanted to go out or go to town, or you were working, like I was nearby, you could leave your windows open quite nicely. There weren't screens. And you would come home and the smell inside would be as bad as it was out. And sometimes there would be bits of straw and manure stuck on the outside of your house. And that because all of us had white houses at that time.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't the colored ones there are today. And
I remember riding the Burnside Wilkinson bus and that smell, and everybody
Yeah.
started
Mhm.
closing their windows. And
yes,
but I guess if it got you 3 crops instead of 2,
yes,
it was worth
yeah.
it.
And you could go down to the dairy, which we did on occasion, and you could buy a pint of milk or a quart of milk, and he would have the little paper tops or cardboardy tops that they would
Yes.
put on, and most of the dairies had their own with the name, and quite often the kids used to love to collect them,
Yeah.
and you could spin them.
Mm-hmm.
And the train used to go across just down where where the Galloping Goose is,
Mm-hmm.
and that was, our son used to watch it out the window. I swear he could hear it coming from Gulfstream, you know.
Which train was that? And is that the
It was
BCI?
a steam train at one time, either CPR or CNR, one of the two. And we had a party line on the phone, which was operated by a telephone operator on Wilkinson Road near Interurban. I'm not sure, Roy Road is it? I believe it was.
Yeah.
And she you would ring and ask for a certain number, and she would put you in contact with that number. and our number was 42W, and our ring was too long and a short. And I had two girlfriends that's parents were on the same line, and one of us would phone one of the others, and the other one would pick up the phone, and we would have a three-way conversation. But the telephone operator, she always knew what was going on and anything important, you know. And one day, my mother's friend, who family owned E&T Raper's Dairy out on Burnside, by Vander Kirchhoff has now, and she phoned, and my dad answered the phone, and she wanted to speak to my mom. And while the operator was getting the number, she says, "You can't speak to her. She's just had a baby." That was me. So the operator knew everything that was going on. And the grocery store and post office was situated at the bottom of Marigold and the Interurban. And she also knew who got what mail from and where they were getting it from. And sometimes it would get flooded over, and they would have to put up a boardwalk so that you could get into the grocery store, post office. And something else. Oh, and going to school at Mackenzie Elementary, we always would take a shortcut during the nice weather, and it was over fenced fields where Mr. Edge, who had a dairy farm by Panama Flats, which was called for several years, and he would put his cattle to graze out in these fields, and we had to climb over 3 stiles in order to get up to Cary Road to go to Mackenzie. And we just hoped when we climbed over we wouldn't be stepping in something we shouldn't. And then in the wintertime we would have to take the long way round, which was Marigold up to Cary Road and up onto Mackenzie Avenue. And then sometimes in the daytime it would be fine to go to school, but if we'd had rain and came home, it might be flooded over, because it would flood over on both sides. And my dad and a few others would put on hip waders and come and pack us all across, the little kids, all across piggyback home.
That's amazing.
And to get a Christmas tree, we didn't have far to go, because there were many, many empty fields, and the houses were few and far between, and we'd only have 2 blocks to walk. And my dad would cut a Christmas tree down, and that would be it. And during the war, we would go downtown and go to Air Force dances at Pat Bay, or Army dances. Some would be out towards Mary Hill, and we would go there, and the buses would take us out, and they would bring us back, and they would take us back downtown, and we would be back in town in time to catch the last bus home, which was probably 11:30. My husband was in the Navy.
Yes.
And he had an identical twin brother, and they served on three of the ships together on the corvette duty during the World War II on the North Atlantic. And we had quite some pranks pulled at some times. They would fool other people, of course. And his brother was musically inclined, and he took up the bass fiddle, and he somehow became connected to the Midnight Ramblers, which was a western country and western group who toured with Willie Nelson, Loretta Lynn, and Marty Robbins, and they did lower BC, Vancouver and that, and they used to practice in our living room, and we had quite the parties here sometime with the Midnight Ramblers, and we enjoyed every bit of it, and had lots of fun too. And
And your husband and brother-in-law were their names?
oh, my husband's name was Martin John. His twin brother was John Martin. And I'm afraid it was very confusing. And years ago, my husband, I think, had a little bit larger nose than his twin brother did. And I can remember my husband saying, I used to hate it growing up because we'd meet people on the street and she'd say, oh, which is which? Oh, I can tell. This one has the larger nose. And so, anyway, and then when they first joined the Navy, my husband had a mole under his chin. And the parade ground instructor would make them work for it. He'd say, Nichols with the mole to the front, ho. And of course, my husband would have to go to the front. Then after that, my husband decided enough of that. And he went and he had it cut off. And so one day, the parade ground instructor hollered, Nichols with the mole to the front. My husband didn't move. So he came back and he looked. He says, okay, you've got me this time, but look out.
Oh, what a mean
So-
thing.
But anyway, we've had a lot of enjoyable moments over the years, and we would have celebrated our 68th wedding anniversary this year. And
What was your wedding date?
May the 28th. Yeah.
You had 2 sons.
I have 2 sons. One is just about ready to retire from Island Farms, and the other one works in the crematorium at Royal Oak. They each have a boy and a girl. One is a granddaughter in Australia, coming home in August for a visit. Grandson is an auxiliary policeman with the city. And the younger 2 grandchildren, the granddaughter is hoping to go into medical field in biology. And the grandson, he's still in grade 12 at Claremont. And my husband's family have all passed away. And I was an only child. So I have 2 wonderful sons and a wonderful granddaughter, daughter-in-law.
Great.
A daughter I didn't have.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
that's lovely. And you told me once about living here, watching the goings-on with the St. Joseph's School across the way. That's kind of provided a lot of entertainment for you to watch the church and the school.
Oh yes,
go
I
up.
watched the school, the church being built, and the school, of course, now enlarging to take in all the children from St. Andrew's Elementary and St. Patrick's Elementary are all going to be housed here. There's another 8 classrooms. So, and I went over here to the open house with my neighbor, and the principal was greeting everybody as they came in, and I'd taken the picture of the church being built. He says, oh, my father designed that church, John DeCastry.
Oh, John DeCastro.
And his name was the principal and that. And the kindergarten teacher is a neighbor of my son that works at the crematorium.
Oh.
And so we had a nice tour of it. And one day they had a great big statue of St. Joseph's on the front of the church. And one morning my neighbor down the street, he phoned and he says, Gracie, phone the police. And he says, there's a man walking on top of the roof of the church. And he said he's broken the hand off of St. Joseph's, and he's pulling the shingles off of the church roof. So there was another fellow had seen him, and he gave chase because he realized he was going to be caught. And he chased him. He followed him in his car, and they caught him on the Galloping Goose not far from the hospital. but he was completely out of it, I think.
Sounds like-
And we've also, in the early days, caught many kids rifling cars on a morning when you never had to lock your cars.
Mm.
And that, we remember phoning the police one morning, and Dale was watching out the window, and he says, yeah, he's going into a Buick, and he's rifling the glove compartment. And the police says, all right, keep tabs on him. And they nailed him. He says, what's he into now? Just as he was approaching. He says, well, he's going through such and such a car. And they nabbed him. And you'd be surprised what they got out of his pockets and stuff.
Oh,
And,
see. That's great.
yeah. And my two sons went to Marigold Elementary. And Dale graduated from Mount View High School like I did.
Mm-hmm.
And then my daughter-in-law and son graduated from Spectrum
That's close by.
after it was built.
Mhm.
And my oldest son, we used to take him to Strawberry Vale not daycare, kindergarten, I guess it was, with Mrs. Cummings.
I didn't know.
Oh, I'm sure she's an icon in the neighborhood over there.
Yeah.
And that was up by the Strawberry Vale School.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Through too.
oh yes, I have pictures of Mackenzie being put through
Mm-hmm.
and that. And never thought I'd see the church being built or Mackenzie Avenue.
No,
And
all on your grandfather's property.
well, not the school, not the,
No.
just this side.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah.
So that's quite an amazing.
Yes, and my grandfather had a lot to do with Strawberry Vale Community Hall, and I helped to build it, and I guess did other things you think of. Oh, my aunt was my mother's sister. Was a heroine, they called her. She saved two different people's lives, rescuing them in a rowboat by herself from people that had sailboats that had overturned. And she was in the assistant or housekeeper for the lighthouse keeper on Barron's Island, which is a very small place near the inner harbor. And she was written up in a book called Wild Roses at My Feet, of the different people in BC that were well known at the time. And then I can say that my uncle was a bootlegger, and he used to sell to your father-in-law.
Off yet.
It would be your father-in-law,
Yeah.
wouldn't it? Yeah. Yeah. My dad used to say, uh-oh, there goes Josiah Bull up the hill.
Yeah. Well, didn't he go to drink somebody's wine?
Yeah, my uncles.
Yeah.
And the Saanich police would buy wine too from him,
Oh.
stuff to make. And then after he passed away, behind the 2x4s in the basement, you know, the ones that come up,
Yeah.
we found all his wine. So my
Oh.
husband and his twin brother made a still. And they distilled the wine. And then when the Midnight Ramblers come, we'd have a party.
Yeah.
And it was the days when you could buy a turkey and a ham and make salads and everything and do it for about $25. There. He's a good boy, aren't you? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. You're a good boy. You a good boy? You spoiled little mutt.